Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. I am so excited to have two guests on our EdTech chat this month in the month of May, where we are also celebrating awareness of disabilities and accessibility here. It is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And we often do some different webinar things and chats and things for this. This is something that all three of us are extremely passionate about. So I'm really happy and thankful that you're all here to join us this month for this EdTech chat. I am Amy Tessitore, the Senior Manager of Onboarding and Adoption here at OpenLMS. And this month I am joined by Michael Vaughn and Gavin Henrik, who both are kind of powerhouses in this area of learning and accessibility and inclusivity. And so I'm really excited that we have them here this month. Gavin is the CEO and co-founder of Brickfield Education Labs, which provides an accessibility platform for Moodle using institutions to effectively manage accessibility and inclusivity of their course material. He has over 20 years experience assisting organizations to implement a range of education technology, including Moodle. And after working for Moodle HQ for over 3 years, Gavin co-founded Brickfield Education Labs to inspire organizations to ensure their learning is accessible for all their learners. A remote-first company, Brickfield is an enterprise Ireland-supported company with staff spread across Ireland, Canada, and Spain. And a little backstory. I kind of met Gavin many years ago through a Moodle accessibility working group that he used to lead, where we were talking about accessibility and how to be more accessible in everything that we do. And that was kind of a long time ago before people were really talking about that. We are also joined by Michael Vaughn. Michael is an academic technologist at App State University, and he has over 15 years of experience in educational technology. He previously worked here at OpenLMS as an adoption and education specialist, helping LMS administrators and instructional designers optimize learning through their LMS. Renowned as a content creator, Michael has over 1.1 million followers and merges his tech expertise with digital communication to reach a global audience. His diverse contributions to the field of education include speaking engagements, training sessions, serving on the board of the Realize Grant at Radford University, and co-founding Elon University's first makerspace, highlighting his dedication to innovation, inclusion, and accessibility in education. Welcome to you both. I am so thrilled that you were able to join us this month. I know that we've had some pretty busy schedules, a lot of traveling going on, so I'm glad that you were able to make it. This month, we are really looking at accessibility, inclusivity, and sometimes I think that there are some preconceived notions about what accessibility is. I think we're still trying to break down some of those ideas that accessibility is. Making sure that you have transcripts for people who are hearing impaired and then making sure a screen reader works. But it's so much more than that. And I think that that's the place I'd like to start this month. Gavin, I'll start with you. When we talk about accessibility, what does that mean? It's obviously more than just a couple of pieces of ed tech or technology running in the background. But what does it really look like when we're accessible?
Well, I'll quote a student from a conference we did about 2 years ago, maybe nearly 3 years ago. And it was a student panel with students with disabilities. And they went, when everything just works and they're not reminded of their disability. So I think that's what accessibility looks like. It's ensuring that there are no barriers there so that people aren't reminded of their disability, in other words, or that any of these barriers don't stop them engaging in an equal, equitable way with the learning and other students. So I think that's probably the best definition I have, but don't know. What's your thoughts?
I would agree with that. I remember when I really first started working in this space, we had an accessibility office. It was one person, it was me. And at the time when I joined, the accessible versions of things where a student could come and request a PDF from you. And that doesn't work. That's a great example of it's not just working. And I agree. I think that accessibility means that when I am accessing education or I am accessing even workplace training, I come in and I access it, and there is no barrier. I'm not having to ask for special access or special software or accommodations for things. And what is there works well, and it's there. I don't have to keep asking someone for assistance. I don't feel like I'm being singled out or that a barrier is in front of me. Michael, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a really strong example to share a little bit later when we're talking about things like really great examples of accessibility done well. Uh,
Mhm.
to pull from that example, there is this really cool TV show that Kelly and I love called Grand Designs. If you've ever watched this show, I can guarantee it's a very nice chill watch. I think you would really enjoy it. Basically, this designer named Kevin McLeod goes around and he interviews couples that are self-building their own homes. Like they're doing all the project management, all that good stuff. And he interviews them in like January, and they show him this amazing house that they want to build. And he says, "How long is it going to take?" And they say, "We'll be in by Christmas." And he says, "What year?" And then they follow him throughout the build, and then you finally get to see the completed thing. And one of the episodes, I'll actually, Chris, I don't know if you're able to take a link from the private chat and toss it in. Um, but in one of the episodes, there was a gentleman who was paraplegic. He lost the use of his legs when he was around 15 years old or so, and then went on to become a Paralympian. And the entire episode is about like the current home and how much of a struggle it is for him to get around and do really basic things versus what he gains in the new home that he is building. And one thing that I really love is when uh, the host was interviewing this guy. His name is Mark Butler, and his wife Penny. And Mark's take on disability was that it's only our environment that makes us disabled. So if I'm in an environment where I can do everything, get everywhere, then the disability goes away. And I I think that's a pretty strong echo of what Gavin was saying earlier, where we think a lot about disability in terms of individuality, like this is something that happened to someone, this is a condition someone was born with, and not so much about the environment that we all share and interact with, and how we can maintain and augment that environment to make it accessible for others. So that was what came to mind for me.
Yeah, and I think you point out something really important here, as does Mark Butler. We have preconceived notions about what accessibility looks like. I've used this example before. So I live in the northeast of the US. It snows here in the winter, it rains a lot in the spring, and then it's really hot in the summer. We have handicap accessible parking, which just means that it's closer to the building. And often there's a little lane on the side that people typically end up blocking anyway, but it's meant for wheelchair accessibility for vans and things like that. However, at my local community college, that is not covered parking, and the college is up on a hill. So when it snows in the winter, despite the fact that we have handicap accessible parking, which should apparently clear up all of the issues and make it easy for people to get places, it doesn't. If it snows while you're in class and you come out, you actually cannot get to your car. There's no covered walkway for you. So you're waiting for someone to have shoveled that or cleared that snow. If you're taking evening classes, as many adults do if they're doing face-to-face classes, because they're probably many people work during the day or have other responsibilities, you are less likely to see the parking lot plowed at night. And so, how are you navigating getting to your car in an area like this? Handicap accessible parking closer to the building is all fine and good. Our colleague Jamie talks about this as well. When she was living in Florida, uh, the grocery store was being renovated and they were redoing the parking lot. And so she approached the manager and said, "Hey, when you do this, can you put the curb brake near where the handicap accessible parking is?" And that had never occurred to anyone. The parking was at the front of the store, but you had to go all the way around the side of the store to get to the curb brake to be able to enter the store. Terrible design, but a good example of how that environment um, creates barriers, and it makes it very difficult for people who are navigating a disability to have equitable access to things, to feel like things are made in an accessible way, or to participate in just the regular activities of daily living because we have by design prevented that,
Of course, it might be an interesting one to actually have that break in both places,
right?
because it's not just for people who are
Hmm.
using a wheelchair. It's also for people who won't be able to step up. And I must admit, your curbs in America are like, I don't know, you expect everyone to be 9 foot tall and be able to just step over these. So people who are maybe struggle with going up steps, or a wheelchair, or someone who's doing a delivery, all of these many things, there's a barrier there. So having multiple curb breaks would make sense, rather than just one. And I think it goes to not people not knowing what accessibility means because they don't understand situational. When they can see a disability, they can at least somewhat understand and empathize. But when they can't see a disability, or the disability only happens in certain circumstances, like why is there a flashing light on a phone in a bar? During the day, it doesn't matter. You can hear the phone ring. And at night, that red light flashing, because the phone call, when the place is packed and too loud to hear anything, means that's suddenly a useful thing. And it's it's just one of those things that you constantly hear. Well, I don't have any students with disabilities in my class, but they don't. People with disabilities don't go around wearing an arrow on their head.
That is a great point because research shows that physical impairments only represent 7% of all impairments and disabilities globally. So, to your point, we often focus on things that are observable, but 93% of what are considered impairments or disabilities are actually invisible. So, you would not see them just to look at someone. And I think that is where accessibility often goes wrong. Is we there's a hyper focus on things like wheelchair accessibility, but it never occurred to someone that someone may have a difficulty stepping up on a curb, or we don't think about people who have neurodiversity. When people are neurodiverse, this often gets categorized as a disability. Some people look at it like a superpower, right? So there are things that, when you have ADD or ADHD, you say, these things are tough for me, but like I can do this thing really well. I'm really great at this thing. And so but that's considered an invisible disability or impairment. And I think this is the place where we often go wrong with accessibility and where we can see things go horribly wrong. Working in this industry and having a lot of experience in instructional design, and Michael and I can attest, we have seen a lot of examples of courses that have been built. And people say, online courses are great. If you have a physical disability or a mobility impairment, you don't have to leave your house to come and take classes. And then you go in and you're blasted with music immediately. There's colors all over the place, poor contrast, and just a very busy course. And that's a great example of accessibility gone wrong. Great idea. Offer something online so that people who have difficulty getting to a face-to-face course have equal access to that content, that course, that type of education. But the design of the course is so poor. It actually creates more barriers than it reduces. And so I want to toss it to both of you to talk about times where you have seen people with maybe good intention or not, where accessibility has gone wrong, and then times where you've seen something done really well, where people really thought about making sure that everyone had access.
I can start off with the one that went wrong and then toss it to Gavin, and then I'll take over with an example of I think accessibility done really well. I'm going to stick with some non-technical examples right now, just so we can look at them sort of metaphorically within the context of the conversation. But one thing that always sticks out to me that I've used as an example for 4 or 5 years now is when there was a disability rights advocate. His name's Nipun Malhotra. He was invited to speak on a panel for a smart cities conference in India. The general idea of the panel was, when we're building cities, how do we build cities of the future so that, everyone is involved, everyone has access. It's important to note that Nipun has physical impairments that leave him in a wheelchair. He cannot move around without the aid of a wheelchair. So he was invited to speak on this panel. They asked him up on stage. There was no ramp for him to actually get on stage. The conference organizers actually had to lift him in his chair, which many folks who permanently use a wheelchair consider it to be an extension of their own body. So this is like a very intimate, uncomfortable thing to have happen. And I think it's an interesting symptom of a larger problem when we try to address shortcomings with accessibility, with inclusion, with diversity, with equity, which is that we will latch on to checkbox actions, things that are really small and simple, that are, at the end of the day, a bit performative and don't necessarily affect actual change for the people who are impacted. But they make the person who's doing it look pretty good, right? It's like, thanks for the land acknowledgements in your email signature. That doesn't change policies that rob Indigenous people of their children. As an example, in places like Canada or Alaska, I think North Dakota also has a case floating around about this right now. I put pronouns next to my name in here. That does not change that my trans brothers and sisters are having their very existence criminalized in several states throughout the United States right now, and are facing persecution worldwide. So, it's nice to have these little checkbox actions. And I'm sure that the people who invited Nipun to come speak at the conference thought that they were checking a box and saying, hey, here's a guy in a wheelchair who's going to come talk about what it's like to be in a city in a wheelchair. And we can pat ourselves on the back because, we've done the work to make sure that diversity is covered at this conference as a topic. If they were truly engaged in activism instead of just performing it, I think that there would have, at the bare minimum, been a ramp at that event for him to get onto stage. So that's one of my bigger concerns of where accessibility can really go wrong is when it ends up being a bit performative by folks who are allegedly allies rather than actual change.
Gosh, I've seen that so many times where you stages with no ramps and or 3 or 4 steps, which are rickety, and it's it's an interesting one. And the organizers of the overall event might have had aspirations in that way, but the practicality of the running event becomes different. And actually, from my perspective, there's so many. You talked about courses, and I've seen people where they're building content, right? So they start off, they'll make really good scripts, they'll make really good videos, and they'll provide captions for them, and that's great. But then they put it into a video platform and embed it in Moodle or whichever LMS they have. So, okay, so they've got this really good caption-based system and so on, wonderful, different speeds on the video, great. But people come along and then do a search in Moodle. And because there's no details, there's no tagging, there's no full transcript of the video within Moodle, the Moodle global search or other LMS searches won't find it because it's just an embed code. So the video doesn't exist. But also then try and print the video for people who want to be able to print it. Or they put it in as open captions, so they're permanently on screen, and so someone can't make them bigger. Because one of the good things with captions in any accessible video player is you can make them bigger, increase the contrast, change the font, all of the things that can be important. So they've done something and they go, yeah, hey, we made our videos better. And they've captions, but they've none of the rest, which are all of these other barriers that they haven't considered because they've considered one. And even when considering that one, then you look at the captions and you go, well, okay, these captions don't name anybody. There's no proper grammar in there. They don't spell out acronyms that might have been used. All of the things, I think it's the CART standard for captioning that they've never read it. They just do captions, yes, okay, they'll spell check it, which is awesome. But yeah, so that's what I've seen. I've seen people expend huge money and time getting good video systems with captions in place, but forget that actually describing visuals in those videos is important, or naming the people if there's multiple people talking, and providing a printable, searchable version of it. And I love in the WCAG, it's a text alternative to a non-text item. The text alternative to video is not captions.
Correct. Full transcript every time we talk about this. Michael and I used to talk a lot about this, and it's something that we do when we're speaking with, that I do when speaking with clients, but also just in general when we talk to people and they say, oh, this video is closed captioning. That's fantastic. I'm glad that you did that. But where's your transcript? You have to have both. And then explaining the reason behind both. One thing that Michael and I have found really useful particularly inside an LMS, was using an activity called H5P to create an accordion just below the video that can be expanded for a full printable transcript, which didn't take us a whole lot of time to create, because we would often run, as we were creating videos, we would have a speech to text platform on the side that would transcribe what we were saying. We would then go in and fix it up, put in some timestamps and who was speaking, and then just paste that right in. So I think one of the other things we see when we talk about accessibility gone wrong is that sometimes people think that making something accessible is going to take so much time, and that's just not necessarily the case. But before we talk about that piece and some of those reasons and why people sometimes don't make things accessible, I know that, Michael, you were going to give us an example of a time that you saw accessibility done really well.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could bug Chris to share the screen one more time, I appreciate it. This goes back to that show that I was talking about earlier, that Grand Designs episode with a guy named Mark Butler. And again, he became a paraplegic when he was about 15 years old or so. And his take was that it's primarily the environment that makes someone disabled. That is obviously not a universal truth necessarily. It's just Mark's particular take on it. But even Penny, his wife, had echoed that one of the biggest things about disability is the space that you have to move around in. And physical spaces and virtual spaces that we create can be significant barriers to success for anyone who is living with a disability or some sort of impairment. One thing that I found interesting was that Mark's house at the beginning of that episode almost felt like it was actively working against him. They had a gravel driveway, so you can sort of see that's not very good surface for someone who is actively using a wheelchair. So even the floor is not helpful. Some other things in there that I found kind of interesting. The shelves were much too high for someone in a wheelchair. So if you needed to reach spices or oils or anything like that, they were typically almost out of reach. The oven was too low, so he had to, again, he does not have the use of his legs, so he had to dangerously bend over when he was trying to put something into the oven or take it back out. If he was cooking on the stovetop, and then let's say he's making some pasta, he has to take it back over to the sink to drain it. This is a very large gap. So, with one hand, he has to push his chair. With the other, he has to hold a pot of boiling or near boiling water and transition it across this entire space to the sink, which is also a bit inconveniently placed when he's trying to do something. And what I found to be the saddest part of the house that they were living in at the beginning was it's a 2-story home. He had lived there. I want to say that they had lived there for 25 years, and he had been upstairs less than 5 times. And that is where his kids' rooms are. So he was never able to go check on them when they were sick. He was never able to go wake them up in the morning, read them bedtime stories, go up and just, if he's playing with them, chasing them around the house, he can't chase them upstairs. Right. So he had this full disconnect, not just from a physical space in his house, but from a pretty intimate part of his life, which is his family, that he could not access. So they built a new home that was designed from the ground up with accessibility in mind. And there were just an awful lot of things about this that were purpose built, that were, I think, relatively small touches that had big impact. So obviously you're going to have some things like very gentle slopes leading up to the house that make it a bit more wheelchair accessible. But even other things that aren't common in homes. For example, all the thresholds were flush with the outside ground. So there is a little bit of gravel in there to help with water runoff, but he can successfully navigate his chair over this threshold because it's relatively flush. The floors are polished concrete. There was plenty of space in between the furniture, so it's easier for him to move around and get to places and like hop up on the couch with his family. The doorways are extra wide, and this one is a little bit easier to see on video, but this doorway is actually 2 doors that come together and meet in the middle. And when you push one, it's linked to the other. So if you push one door to open it, the other opens as well, and they are pocket doors. So instead of being in the way after you open it, if you're in a wheelchair, they just tuck away into the wall, so they are out of the way. Obviously, the bathroom was made accessible, so he had a spot to sit with a detachable head so that he could clean himself very easily. There was also a bathtub that was basically flush with the outside, so he could easily get in and out. He could easily access the hot and cold water controls. And there are little things that we don't necessarily think about, like putting the sink lower and putting the mirror lower. For years, he was not able to use the mirrors in his own home because they were mounted too high. Right? Most of us would consider it to be a normal height because most of us are probably not in a wheelchair. But for him, even seeing himself in a mirror was out of place. What I especially loved was the kitchen. There was this really cool countertop in here, this table that a friend of theirs built, and it was the perfect height for him to pull up in his wheelchair so that he could eat alongside his family who might be eating at the bar height chairs. He could also do prep work here if he needed to cut or chop something. And this is a copper surface, so it's antimicrobial, easier to clean. The oven ranges were moved from the floor up to chest height, so he can actually put things in and out of the oven without having to bend over now. He can actually just grab them directly. The oven doors don't just fold down, they also tuck in underneath the oven so that they're out of the way and they don't block the pathway. There are very large drawers that are about like chest height that you can pull things out of and easily transition them over to the induction range top that was built into the island. There are these handholds that are built into the countertops. So most countertops have a little bit of an overhang. These actually have handholds that are built in everywhere. So if he has boiled something on a stovetop, he can easily pull himself over to the sink to drain that pasta without having to worry about burning himself or navigating across a very large space. There are also no handles on the cabinet doors or drawers, so there's nothing sticking out to get caught on his chair. There's even a lift in that house so that he can get from the first floor to the second to finally like read his kids a bedtime story. And these are, again, with the exception of the lift, relatively small changes that you could make to any environment that have a huge impact on his quality of life. Things that don't exist because the way his house was built as a standard at the beginning of the episode was for a person who's not in a wheelchair with no consideration for the fact that someone else might exist. And I find that to be pretty sad. Pretty sad. I won't belabor the point, but I will say, my partner and I, we built our home a few years ago. And part of the reason that we are on a single story home is because her job has a pretty serious risk of permanent long-term disability, either through a back injury or a hip or knee injury that could affect her mobility. So we didn't want there to be stairs in the house in case we ever had to switch over to aided access in there. So it's possible to build environments that accommodate for everyone that still have an awful lot of really nice features and look like they were designed for everyone all at once. Really do love this particular example.
Yeah, I think that, television shows like this, which are broadcast to obviously a much larger segment of the population, help to highlight some of the everyday barriers that people living with, in this particular case, a mobility impairment might face. But when we think about accessibility, right? So we've talked it's observable impairment. This affects a certain percentage of the population. There are other things too, right? And so when we kind of take it back into like the education realm, so obviously it's a huge issue if your home is not accessible for you. Now imagine you're going into your online classroom or even a physical classroom. And it's really important that you don't have barriers there as well. So, Gavin, what are some examples of accessibility done well that you've seen?
Well, there's so many, but I'd like to actually grab the question which was asked there and included. So, where I have seen accessibility done well is when people look at all of the different barriers and design from the beginning with recognizing that to reduce barriers. So when they're writing their script for their video and they've all the names for it, they then have that as the basis for their transcript. And although it is important to think of progress, not perfection, but this is the thing over time. My reference earlier was really about the people think that they've done enough. That's it. Where that's one step. Those captions are one step. The putting into a good video platform is another. Having it in Moodle, having the transcript there, having it printable, work with immersive reader and so on. These are all steps you can do over time. And that's the main thing. It's when people put together a project to address all of these different things over time, right? Because you can't drop in a bit of technology to just work straight away. But if I go back to that, just to the one particular course example, so all of their interactive H5P stuff was also in a Word document initially. That's where it was designed. All the quiz questions, all the transcripts, all the directions, image descriptions were all there, so that in creating the H5P, it was following this plan. But then they had it at the end, and I think that was the real thing. They planned to have a fully accessible text version before they created the interactive H5P one. As someone said to me the other day, the H5P or the SCORM type, that interactive piece, is just one manifestation of the original content. But the original content is accessible by default. And that's the best example I can have. That you can have really good interactive stuff, but the actual source material, where all of the quality control, the spelling, the grammar, that's done in Word or Google originally. So using that as a polished document, I think is really important, and recognizing that for what it is.
And I think that echoes the sentiment to Gavin of Gloria Russell in the chat. And Gloria said, how about progress, not perfection? And what you said was, it's not just about dropping the technology in. This is a long term, we continue to work toward making things accessible. And so when I think of accessibility done right, I think about at my former job, there was an instructor, a faculty member there named Christine Jones, and Chris's organization style was very color coded, and that worked really well for her. And at the time, you could do a lot of colors still in Moodle, and so the course was kind of laid out that way as well. With, assessments were going to be in this color, and due dates were in that color. And we had a conversation one day, and we started to talk about that method. And she said, I just realized that works for me, but if you are colorblind, that's not working for you. You see no association between what's happening. And she kind of embarked on this journey to really think about how she was putting content in a course from the perspective of someone who just wasn't her, who that color coding wasn't going to work for a variety of reasons. And over the course of several years, and she got to work pretty quickly, but over the course of, time, probably I'd say 4 years or so, she just continued to approach all of her course design from the perspective of, I'm not making a course for me. I'm making a course for everyone who's not me, because I only have my own context and my own lived experience to approach this from. And if I do that, then the course is only for me, but it's never going to work for someone who has a different life, a different set of barriers, a different way of approaching how they come into courses. And I think that is is the thing that I think about when I think about accessibility done well, because it was the intent. It is a process, and you continue to work on it over time. There's always something, that I hadn't thought about before that I learn. I learn a lot every single day of my life. And I would say that accessibility is something I learn a lot about on an ongoing basis. And so you always have to be kind of a work in progress with that. But I think it's that ability to look at things from a context that isn't yours, looking from someone else's perspective. I only have my own lived experience to go on. And I have to remember that I'm not creating courses for me. And so I think that is super helpful. I'm seeing some really amazing comments in the chat about, places that we were all seeing issues, people still not using alt text. Emmanuel's talking about context accessibility, specifically, when we talk about cultural. And this is really brings us to the next topic. We as a group were kind of chatting this morning about the intersectionality pieces here. So when we think about accessibility, we often say, this person has this. This is their disability, and we're going to design for this thing. But that's not life. There's an intersection of a variety of different things. Someone could have more than one impairment or disability. Someone could have a disability and be from an underrepresented community. So like easily double to triple the number of barriers there, because there are barriers outside of things that are considered a classified disability. And I think that's what I want to talk about next, because that's where the inclusivity piece comes in, which is when we talk about the intersection of accessibility and inclusivity, how do we approach that? What are some ideas that we have to make sure that people feel represented, that the learning environment is inclusive and accessible. Gavin, I'll toss that one over to you first.
So this whole area of inclusivity and DEI and intersectionality is a challenge because often and disability is not really covered by that. And again, it's we're doing something and that's enough. It might cover gender, it might cover race, and not go further. And one of the things that we try and show in our training or in our presentations is around that you can't design for supporting a person with one disability because they could have many. You might have somebody who is dyslexic, but it also happens to be in a situational barrier of they're holding their kid while making dinner and listening to their coursework because they're just busy, or they're a single parent, or their partner's working, whatever it might be. So they're not going to be using their keyboard. They can't be reading on a screen because they're sorting out their food, but they need to listen to it. So someone who chooses to have that audio version of their content is supporting people with many situational and permanent and temporary disabilities. I think that's where you need to think of them all. And if you just think of the barriers, then you can cope with the DEI and the intersectionality, because there is some research shown. I was reading a journal article earlier about disability and other identities. It's Harry Wickenden from one of the universities in the UK, and we're talking about all of this. And with some of the other articles as well, it was that often you can have that double and treble effect, but that can also then limit people. So you have to be very individual when you're talking about a person, but then you have to try and look at just barriers when you're not. Because if you just name different cases like race, like gender, and things where you want to be inclusive, then there are other ones that you're not naming as well, and you just have to balance things in that way. So, but disability is often not represented in plans or in the implemented plans for inclusivity and especially DEI.
Yes. Michael, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I would echo a bit of what Gavin said. I have noticed that accessibility seems to be like the annexed part of any plan. It's always at the end. Have you noticed that? There's always a strategic plan, and accessibility is always the last thing on the list instead of the first, when in reality, if you're trying to design with everyone in mind from the beginning, it tends to eliminate a lot of the other challenges that you'll see along the way. But yeah, this is a larger issue that requires a bit of introspection, a bit of personal growth, a bit of effort on the part of the course designer, and a bit of intention. And, I'm not going to sit here and pat myself on the back. I'll just give a quick example of, in my prep for this session, I knew I wanted to give the example of the gentleman who was invited to come speak on a panel for Smart Cities of the Future, who was wheelchair bound and did not have a ramp to actually be able to get up onto the stage. If you had talked to me maybe 6-7 years ago and I saw his name and tried to pronounce it out loud, I probably would have done that thing that they do in doctors' waiting rooms, or like if they're calling someone for dinner reservations or whatever, and been like, oh gosh, so sorry, I'm gonna butcher this. It's probably gonna be Nippon Malhotra. And all it took was about 90 seconds of Googling to find a YouTube video where he introduced himself and said, hi, my name is Nipun Malhotra, and now I know how to pronounce his name properly. It took 90 seconds of effort to solve a solvable problem. And it's really just that extra bit of effort that I think tends to contribute towards that progress towards perfection. When we talk about creating more inclusive spaces, when we talk about creating more accessible spaces, I think it was maybe Nancy or Stacey Reagan who had said something in the chat about, oh gosh, it's floating away from my brain. This is gonna make me so sad. Yeah, closing your eyes and listening to the audio. I have to be really intentional, because a lot of times when I present things, I'm presenting things visually. The slide deck that I had earlier to show screenshots of the show had, I think, 19 or 20 screenshots in it. And I tried to be really careful to not say, as you can see here, look at this. There was a panel with the doors where I was trying to describe the doors without using the verb, okay, as you can see here, and look at how this works. And, is it most effectively communicated through video? Yeah. If you're sighted. Yeah. This is one of those things where I think it takes a little bit more priority and effort, sustained intentional effort on the part of the people who are organizing and designing the content to help cut off some of these issues before they ever become issues.
One of the things that we do when we present at a conference, I did the same at the Canadian Moodle Moot just last week where I was in Toronto, and that's using Present Live, part of PowerPoint 2, which is a button that most people there, I think out of the 200 plus people who were there, I think probably 80% of them had never heard of it, but 80% of them were using Microsoft Office, at least in my discussions. And it's a feature that's been there for years, where you can simply add an extra little button in there to present, gives people a QR code so they have a transcript, even in a face-to-face lecture, transcript in front of them, translated into whatever, 30-something different languages. They can see the slides that are there available to them, or they could choose to listen to it if they wanted to. So it's having that kind of practice, having that little bit of progress. And that's just to get people to start seeing that actually some of this is just really easy to do. Because often people think that inclusivity is difficult, it is technical, it's complicated, it takes a huge amount of time. None of it's from the beginning. And I think that's why, so having those multilingual and transcript there for people, and for those who can't remember the previous slide, instead of rewinding the teacher, which is a bit difficult in real life, they can just jump back a slide to double check what was on it. You're helping multiple people, you're removing multiple barriers. So it doesn't matter who's in the audience because you're trying to support them all.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm looking at the chat here and I see that Emmanuel's comment, thinking beyond the curriculum to meet all the users, those who are challenged with the content, and even those who already understand it. I'm going to attempt to share screen here. And give me one moment. I want to share something that I saw on social media the other day. Hopefully this will, there we go. This was a post made on Threads, and it says, when I was in 4th grade, I was in the gifted program and they let us go to the library more often, which meant we had more chance to take the accelerated reader tests and get points. And whoever reached a certain threshold got to go to Chuck E. Cheese. For those not familiar, Chuck E. Cheese is a pizza place that's really geared toward kids. It has kind of animated characters and then like animatronic characters and games and things. So it's a big deal to go. And the person said, so I'd go around asking people I knew had a hard time reading what their login were, and I would sneak in to take the test for them so they could go to Chuck E. Cheese too. I got caught and they didn't let me go to Chuck E. Cheese, but it was worth it. And I bring this one up because I mentioned this the other day to some people, and I said, this is a good example of what equity and inclusion is and is not. And I think that, and so some people responded that, well, now these kids got to unfairly go to Chuck E. Cheese. And I was like, so let's back that up. The children who most would have benefited from library access had the least access because they needed it the most. And the children who would most have benefited from encouragement and reward for continuing to work at something that was very difficult for them had the least access to that type of reinforcement. And so to Emmanuel's point, when we talk about setting up the curriculum and ensuring that we have the correct supports in place, that is for people who are challenged with the content and even those who already understand. I was absolutely floored by this because basically the inequity here is that not every child in that school had equal access to the library. By default of not being a strong reader, you automatically didn't get access to the library. And I think these are the things that when we think about where we continue to need to improve, it's things like this. Reward systems are great. Encouraging people is fantastic. And I am all for that type of motivation. But limiting someone's access to something like a library is extremely troublesome. And I think that we see that sometimes still in education today. And I just wasn't, have you all kind of seen or experienced things like this? And if so, what are some ideas of ways that we can just do better all the way around?
Yeah, it's one of those things where when I think about it, I think we don't want to put students in a position where they have to ask for something necessarily because it doesn't exist or because it's not available. Um, One thing that I found so interesting using Brickfield's like accessibility review tools is most of the content in the courses that I've worked with is is actually pretty accessible by default. There's an awful lot of content that's already ready to go. These are refinements to existing content. And sometimes it's a bigger lift, like creating a transcript for a video. Sometimes it's a smaller lift, like we're going to add a very brief alt text description for this image to provide more context and description for someone using a screen reader. And I think sometimes when we have these conversations, people feel like we're asking them to create an entirely new thing and do this incredible amount of work. And very often it's this series of small lifts that will actually get people back to where we want to be. When I think about accessibility, where it hits inclusion and intersectionality, they've done studies that show that they've basically taken some statements about someone's work and said like, okay, this person said they did a really great job, they're really proud of the work that they did, and they would say, okay, this was a guy saying this, how would you rate his performance at work based off of his self-assessment? And the men were consistently rated really high, like, oh, he must be a really high performer, he must be a very good worker, his colleagues probably like working with him. And then flipped it around and said, okay, those statements were actually made by a woman, and then all of a sudden she's being overly ambitious, this is a little self-centered, this is a bit self-aggrandizing. And it's just so interesting how people are treated differently based off of race, based off of gender, based off of general identity or religion, as an example. And when you flip things around and create environments where they don't have to ask for access to things, they don't have to self-advocate for things that should be there anyway, you might be doing a little lift on your end to do something like create a transcript, but saving a huge lift for someone else. If I think of, let's say, a Black woman who is in a wheelchair permanently, it is hard enough being in a wheelchair permanently, but then to have to turn around and advocate for yourself, knowing that people are not going to treat your advocation or self-advocation seriously, that they might actually see it as you being fussy or you kicking up the dust for no reason or just being cranky or ornery or whatever. And not taking you as seriously, and you have to advocate even harder to get the things that you need. Now we're in a spot where that person is burning up considerably more time and more personal energy to get something that they should have had to begin with. So when I say like, don't make people ask, I mean literally from the ground up. What are we doing to build courses, to build learning environments, to create learning spaces where students don't have to ask for the things that they need?
That is so important, and it's. I think the World Bank talk about this. So 20% of women have a disability, or women and girls have a disability, and that's their percentage. Obviously, when you take all of the different barriers into account, there's a much higher percentage. But they're sort of setting out there, and they have a very specific program around supporting women and girls with disabilities and working on inclusivity in that area. But I think that accessibility is about using content better. It's about those consistent improvements. I don't know, can I just I'll just give you a URL to, can I quickly screen share? Is that possible? Just
I think so. I think there's a
something in
present
here.
button down
There
at the
we go.
bottom. There
Okay.
we go.
Sharing screen is 2 monitors. Blah. Yeah, fine, whatever. Share screen and that one. Okay. So one of the things, so some of you will have seen this, I hope, if that is showing. No. So these are the cubes we have, which have 3 little tips. These happen to be in French, in case you're wondering. 3 tips about the different types of content and how you can do better. So it isn't going, hey, here's the list of 20 things that you absolutely must do. It's about from where you are now, try and do these 3 things. So for tables, yeah, don't merge cells. I know they can be technically accessible, but they're a little bit more complicated to do. Keep it simple, have proper headings, have links being descriptive. It's just these little bits of improvements, as you said. And I think with our toolkit, we have the same philosophy, these 6 areas. And I think that's really important to be able to get across to people that it's not a, yes, you need to become a WCAG expert. You need to understand POUR and all these other acronyms. And that's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And POUR is the way they structure them: perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. So we don't push that. We're pushing, hey, let's do content better. Okay, than where you are now. These are the things, how you move forward, how you get progress. I think that's really important. I'll just stop sharing there. But we've these, cubes and zines to try and have learning aids for people to just get that idea that it's about just doing better. And one of the universities here in Ireland, who isn't one of our clients, they're ordering 300 of these to give to their non-academic staff who are covered by UDL training. But to all their IT staff, their student registry, all the ones who contact students in general, that they'll have this general idea of accessibility. And I'm going to put them all on their desks when they start next term.
We've got lots of love in the chat for this. Marcy said she loves POUR. And Gavin, I think you point out something important there, which is, we talk about the different standards, like, different accessibility standards. In the countries we live in, we tend to know what the regulations are. But to the average instructor, just throwing those acronyms around isn't super helpful. We tell them you have to do this thing, but then how do we get them there? And again, I echo Michael's sentiment. Having your accessibility toolkit and courses has been the thing that helps people. We often will say to them, you may see a lot of errors up front from, one, not all of these, the accessibility features were in these platforms when we first started building courses and teaching. So there's things to go back and fix. But what you're going to find is there's probably a pattern. There's often a thing that you do that you didn't know you were doing. And not only does the toolkit tell you, this is what we're seeing, but this is what we should be seeing. This is what the expected behavior is. And then a link to go and fix that automatically. This really helps people. So being able to have some sort of framework there, have a tool or a resource there that explains what the accessibility issue is. I think that we are kind of out there kind of individually working with the different faculties at places that we've been employed. And Marcy has said there, she's been trying to work on with her faculty on things. And so we don't, always get the message out globally to people about how we can improve accessibility. And I think that's a place that is when we think about some of the barriers to creating accessible content, right? What are some of those common barriers? I'll tell you right now that when I worked in higher ed, I actually had the comment, we don't have any students with disabilities here. And I said, you don't have any students who've come and declared a disability, because in higher ed, you have to declare your disability to qualify for disability services, which is a separate issue. Again, if we design if everything's accessible by design, then no one should have to come and tell me that they have a disability. But there was a true belief that because no one had declared that they had a disability, there were no students with a disability attending these classes. So that's one common barrier that I think that I've seen. What are some common things that you hear people say, or barriers that you've observed to creating accessible and equitable content in courses?
I think probably an inclusion perspective. I'm so sorry if you can hear the lawn mowing in the background. Oh, I forgot I had this thing enabled. All right, are we gonna do a laser show? Yep, there we go. The inclusivity is a big part of it. So going back to what you were saying, Amy, there are some students who will not feel comfortable disclosing a disability or impairment if the instructor is not created an environment where it is safe to do so. There were instructors that I had worked with in the past who thought that ADHD was literally just a made-up condition, and that students were faking it, and that this was just a fancy workaround to get more time to take tests. And that is not a person that I would feel comfortable going to and saying, hey, I've got ADHD, I've got some comorbidities that go along with it, and I need that extended test time. I would almost feel like there would be a hostility or a level of hostility there that might be dangerous to disclose, because maybe that person might grade me more harshly because they think that I am lying to them. So that was one of my things that, sorry, the mower's coming back by. I'm going to toss it to Gavin.
Oh, gosh. Yes. I think for certain accommodations and supports, yes, they might need to register beyond what can be done within digital and so on, if they need a reader and stuff. But having people to prove that their disability is severe enough to get basic things like a PDF, like our PDF turned into a Word document, so they can use immersive reader. That's like if they're dyslexic or whatever reason they particularly need it. There's a post on one of the accessibility groups I'm involved in, and it was that teachers are going, hey, how do I stop my college going back to pre-COVID? And what he meant was that they want the students in the classroom, they want the bums on seats, so they've stopped sharing and creating any video recordings. Wow.
It's really all you can say about that is wow, right? Like, why would you want to go that direction? And and that kind of speaks to a comment I'm seeing right now in the chat, which is that the experience is that it's the strict adherence to standards rather than using some common sense there. We strictly adhere to these specific standards, but don't think about the learning environment. Don't think about who's accessing the content. Don't think about the fact that having a video to come back to or something like that would be extremely helpful for people. I think, again, some of that comes back to that old school sage on the stage, like I have the information and I'm going to keep it and I'm going to tell you when you get to have it, versus saying, this is great. I am so excited to share information and to create this collaborative experience. So many cool things you can do with video, even if you're doing a face-to-face course. Putting video in your online classroom afterwards so that students can create a collaborative note-taking doc is a great way to help people learn content. I'm just always shocked too by the concept that learning can only happen when you are seated at a desk staring at a person. That is the place that I learn the least. Is just sitting for an hour and a half listening to someone go through a 300 slide PowerPoint deck, versus in that the e-learning space where I can go and practice things, and I'm encouraged to go and capture more knowledge by searching the internet or finding resources or talking with other people. So some of those things as well, I think, are also that mindset is overall a hindrance to accessibility and inclusion. We are right up at time now, and so we will say goodbye for today, but I just want to leave you with a couple of last minute thoughts, which is that as we look at how we create accessible spaces, we must also make sure that they are inclusive and that we're understanding the intersectionality between disability and impairments, as well as other factors such as race, gender identification, religion, socioeconomic status, sex, and things like that. Those all come together to create the perfect storm for just barriers everywhere if we are not thinking outside of our own contextual and lived experience. I just want to thank both Michael and Gavin for joining us today. And sharing their experiences and their thoughts. Be sure to tune in next month for our next EdTech chat. And also, we will have these posted in Open LMS Academy. The recording of this will be posted there in a course. So if you've never been, stop by academy.openlms.net, and you will have the opportunity to register for the EdTech Chats course, where you'll be able to access the recordings for this EdTech chat and those in the past. Thank you both for joining us today. I really appreciate that you both took time out of your schedule to be here today and talk about this topic with us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. That was great.